Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome back to the Lockdown Litfest studio. As ever, all of us at Lockdown Litfest, we hope you are well, we hope you're keeping safe, and we hope you're being careful in these anxiety-inducing times. We also hope that you're enjoying the content we are working 20 hours a day, burning midnight oil to provide for you. If you do enjoy it, if you do, feel free to tell your friends and direct them to the www.lockdownlitfest.com and sign up for the newsletter. We have a hell of a roster of guests coming up for you over the next couple of weeks. We also have a hell of a guest today. Biographer, critic, scholar and broadcaster Jonathan Bate is Professor of English Literature at Oxford University. He's held the marvellously named post of Professor of Rhetoric at Gresham College in the City of London and is Foundation Professor of Environmental Humanities at Arizona State University. His wide-ranging academic research includes Shakespeare and Renaissance Literature, Romanticism, biography and life writing, ecocriticism, contemporary poetry, and more besides. And he has 20 plus publications which are testament to his love and fascination, not only of good writers, but of great writing, not least including a rather magnificent unauthorized biography of Ted Hughes, which I'm delighted to be able to commend to you. We're going to talk about all sorts of things today, but first of all, let me say a very warm welcome to the Lockdown Litfest. Jonathan, how are you?
I'm very well indeed, Paul. I'm here in Arizona. It's only 105 degrees Fahrenheit today, and it's not a bad place to be locked down, but it's great to be with you in the studio.
You look very relaxed. I very much like the professorial shirt. It's looking very dashing here today.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. Yes. More Arizona than Oxford, definitely.
Yeah, well, yes, more Arizona than Oxford, I'll say, exactly. Can we start with starting point? So where your fascination, as I said in the introduction, for good quality literature, for good quality writers started? Let's start slowly, shall we? Were you from a bookish family?
Yeah, definitely there were a lot of books around the house. And my father was a teacher of the classics. And one strand of my work, quite clearly, I think, comes from that. I've written a lot about the classical influences on Shakespeare. But I guess, like so many people, it was having great teachers while I was a teenager. I honestly think my teachers at school were the best teachers that I've ever had, and I had some pretty distinguished teachers once I went on to university. But the inspiration that came from that teaching was really the thing that fired me out.
It's always a teacher, isn't it? For me, it was a chap called Stephen Tranter who really fired my imagination. There's one thing, just because I mentioned the word eco-criticism, and I was trying to explain to a godchild of mine yesterday, when he saw me, or didn't see me, when we were discussing things on Zoom chat, when I was drafting up my introduction. He said, "Why would you criticize ecology?" And I said, "Well, that's not what eco-criticism is. And I will resist the temptation to describe myself. You're far better placed to do it. Could you describe for those that are unfamiliar what it is?"
Well, it's funny actually. He said that because in a way his instinct. Funny enough, I was having a similar thought yesterday about this very word criticism. That for 200 or 300 years, the act of close reading literature and judging literature has been called criticism. But implicit in the word criticism is saying negative things about it. And one of the things that I'm a little unhappy about in academic life, academic English departments these days, is there is a tendency to criticize, in the negative sense, great writing, maybe because it reveals the sexism, the racism, the classism of its age. And I'm almost beginning to wonder whether we need a different word other than criticism, because I come not to bury my authors, as Shakespeare would say, but to praise them. So much of my work is an analysis of praise. I want to find what is good, and criticism is an odd word for that. As for eco-criticism, what that simply means is doing literary criticism, close reading of literature, especially great literature, but from the point of view of what it might tell us about ecology and the environment. So a feminist critic will look at literary works from the point of view of what they tell us about gender, the representation of women. A post-colonial critic will talk about what literary texts might tell us about imperialism and the colonial project. An eco-critic will say, gosh, William Wordsworth, he understood about the relationship between communities and their environment. He understood about the importance of green things for us. That's eco-criticism.
Well, I'm delighted. He'll be watching this when he goes out, and he'll be delighted to have learned from the master. Jonathan, you spent so much time, so much of your academic career, so much of your writing career immersed in Shakespeare and Renaissance literature. You know, one would imagine an imbecile like me would think everything that's been written about Shakespeare has been written about Shakespeare. What more could there possibly be? What were you hoping to turn up? What were you hoping to discover? What were you hoping to prove?
Well, that's the amazing thing about Shakespeare, isn't it? I mean, he's been more written about than any other writer, and yet he remains infinitely rewarding. You know, I've been reading, watching, teaching, writing about these works for 40 years, and I still find new things that I hadn't noticed before. I think in terms of what I've particularly tried to focus on, it's two things really. As a writer, I'm always interested in what makes a writer, what are the forces that shape a writer. And as a writer who hopes maybe, you know, to be read by a few people even after I'm dead, I'm interested by the way in which the work of writers endures through the ages. So in a way, a lot of my work on Shakespeare could be divided into two parts. Books on the origins of Shakespeare, the forces that shaped Shakespeare. And in particular there, and maybe this goes back to, you know, my father being a teacher of the classics, the way that studying the Greek and Roman classics, the Roman history and literature especially, in high school and the grammar school in Stratford-upon-Avon, the way that was a formative influence on him. So one of my recent books is called How the Classics Made Shakespeare. And it's just about how Elizabethan culture is so profoundly shaped by classical antiquity. But then the second thing is the way that Shakespeare has endured through history. I wrote my PhD on the way in which the Romantic poets, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Shelley, Byron, were all obsessed with Shakespeare. And for me, the lovely thing about that is it gave me one foot in the Renaissance and one in Romanticism. And those are two areas of literature that people absolutely still love. And rather pleased that a year or two ago, the Royal Mail asked me to choose some Shakespearean quotations for a set of stamps for his 400th anniversary. And now for William Wordsworth's 250th anniversary, they've asked me to choose quotations from the Romantic poets for another set of stamps. And I think that's a sign that Shakespeare and the Romantics, they're these living authors.
Absolutely, I like that. I mean, this question is rather personal, forgive me. You've spent so much time immersed in Shakespeare. Do you get a sense of the man and what drove him? Could you give us any insights into what you think of him as a man, let alone as a writer?
Yeah, it's a great question because he's very elusive as a man. So in a way, you have to work from quite a lot of negative evidence. There are records of what he was like in conversation, what he was like as a friend. Ben Jonson, a rival playwright, but also a friend, wrote very movingly about Shakespeare's kindness and quick-wittedness. There are also anecdotes saying that he was quite a shy man. Sometimes when all the actors were going to go out on the town, he'd say, "Oh, I've got a headache. I'm going to stay home." One of the things that makes him very different from so many of the other writers of the time is that he was very good at keeping his cards close to his chest. Pretty well every other dramatist of the time was arrested or imprisoned or prosecuted or had a play censored and closed down for either political or religious reasons. That never seems to have happened with Shakespeare. So he was very canny like that. And in a way, that it is exactly that elusiveness of his personality and his beliefs that makes him so rewarding, so open to so many different readings.
The reason I asked the question is, of course, you wrote Being Shakespeare, the one-man play for Simon Callow, and I was wondering what research brought into that, and then how was it poignant watching a brilliant actor like Simon Callow voicing your words and those of Shakespeare on a stage? That must have been quite an extraordinary moment when you first saw it.
Absolutely. No, of all the things I've done, that's perhaps the one that has moved me most. The play was devised in close conjunction with my biography of Shakespeare called Soul of the Age. Both the play and the biography were structured around Shakespeare's idea that life can be divided into 7 ages. And what we sought to do in that play, as well as give Simon the opportunity to play bits of all the great Shakespearean roles he'd never had the chance to play before, but what we sought to do was to select passages from the plays where Shakespeare's heart did seem to be particularly in the writing. When he writes about the loss of a child, for example, something that he experienced, when he writes about the experience of beginning to feel that he's growing old. And to see a great actor sort of move through those different ages of life whilst also telling the story of Shakespeare's life did, I think, give an extraordinary sense of what it was like to be Shakespeare.
I was fortunate enough to see that, and I have to say it moved me to tears. Simon just was extraordinary. I mean, what an extraordinary performance by an extraordinary performer. There's one of those beautiful theatrical productions where all the links of the chain seem to work to, from the script to the production to the performance were just magical. I've got goosebumps thinking about it now.
Oh, thank you.
You mentioned the Romantic poets in conjunction with Shakespeare. Our audience is international, global, and very diverse. Could you give us a quick 101 on what you mean by the Romantic poets, and then we'll start to talk about why you have this enduring fascination for them?
So, round about the end of the 1700s, across Europe, there's a new feeling in the air. There's a kind of a revolution of the feelings, a new fascination with imagination, with self-expression, with the idea that the creative arts, poetry, music, the novel, can explore human identity and particularly human emotions in all sorts of new ways. And looking for a model for an expression of every aspect of what it means to be human, those writers, perhaps beginning with some writers in Germany, particularly the great German writer Goethe, and then a group of writers in England, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, a philosopher and intellectual as well as a poet, William Wordsworth, and then a little after that, some younger poets, John Keats, Lord Byron, Percy Shelley. They all immersed themselves in Shakespeare. But at the same time, they were conscious that they were in a new world. The French Revolution had just taken place. All sorts of social changes were taking place. Slavery was being abolished, and clothing was becoming looser. Everybody was really able to be free, to be energetic, and that movement is what we call Romanticism.
I love the fact, that little detail, clothing was becoming looser. There was an untightening of the buttons. The freedom.
There was.
Freedom.
Yeah, one of the things I mentioned when I talk about Wordsworth as part of the Romantic movement is, as I say, long hair for men, short hair for women. As I say, women's clothing beginning to fit the mould of the body, getting rid of wigs and masks and so on. That idea of a kind of naturalness of dress, of behaviour. And along with that, of course, comes a feeling that maybe we should experiment. So this wonderful moment when the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge and another poet, Robert Southey, his friend, they decide they're going to go off and form a commune on the banks of the Susquehanna River. Yeah. The scheme came to nothing, but there's a kind of idealism, a sort of utopianism, idea we are making a new world, and free love might be a part of it. Lord Byron, the most famous of all the Romantic poets, was famously promiscuous, and there were all sorts of ménage à trois among the Romantics.
I'm going to assume that most people are familiar with the works of Coleridge and indeed of Wordsworth. What I want to try for you to help me understand is what the friendship between those two men led to, how important it was to both their works, obviously with perhaps more emphasis on Wordsworth himself, who we're going to come to in a minute, because that seems to be a tipping point in this new movement and a tipping point in the career of both those writers.
It absolutely is. So William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, they both start writing poetry in the early 1790s. In the case of Wordsworth, he actually literally walked into the French Revolution. He went on a walking tour with a student friend, and they found themselves walking into the French Revolution. And that was a key formative influence on his early thinking. But in terms of the quality of his writing, of his poetry, and similarly with Coleridge's, it wasn't until they met each other towards the end of the 1790s, down in the West Country of England, that suddenly these two writers came together and they fed off each other. Coleridge, the more intellectual, Wordsworth, the great observer of nature. And they came up with this idea of a collaborative volume of poems. Coleridge lived for a time with Wordsworth and his sister, then they lived very close by each other. And there's a period of about 10 years where they are incredibly close friends and they produce all their best work.
Yeah.
Wordsworth actually, under the influence of Coleridge says, you are the greatest poet since Shakespeare, the greatest poet of our time. You need to write a great epic poem, because that's what a major poet should do. Don't write an epic poem about history, about theology, like Milton's Paradise Lost. Write about yourself. Write about man, nature, society from your point of view. And so Wordsworth becomes the first writer in history to write an epic poem that is an autobiography. And he addresses it to Coleridge. He keeps saying, dear friend, this is about my life. This poem is for you. And then there comes a moment he finishes the poem and he reads it to Coleridge, to Wordsworth's, to sister Dorothy, and by this time he's married. And that's like a climax to their careers. And Coleridge writes a short poem in response, and he says, when I finished hearing this poem, I knelt as if in prayer, because Wordsworth has taken us to the dread watchtower of man's absolute self. What an amazing phrase. The idea that the sense of what is a self, what is it like to be an individual? That is what Wordsworth has discovered through poetry. Coleridge praises him for that. But then they fall out. They have various quarrels. Coleridge becomes an alcoholic and a drug addict. Wordsworth becomes rather pompous. And their work falls away. I mean, in the latter part of their lives, they wrote no memorable poems. I mean, every great line of Wordsworth, one or two exceptions, is from that 10-year period of the friendship with Coleridge.
But what a 10-year period, Jonathan. I mean, people would give up their souls to have 10 years like that.
Yeah, and it was a joy to write a new biography of Wordsworth that focused on that period, focused on the making of Wordsworth as a child in the Lake District, the huge influence on him of his experience in France, walking into the French Revolution, falling in love, having an illegitimate child. But then as the revolution turned to violence and England went to war with France, he had to leave his child, leave his lover, leave his political ideals because they had turned to blood. And then returning to his sister Dorothy, this great friendship with Coleridge, and then going back to the Lake District of his home. And that's when he starts writing about a community of people living at one with nature. And for me, that's when he begins to become an ecological poet, to go back to where we began our conversation.
We shall come to that in a second. You, I think it was last year, perhaps 2 years ago, you made a fantastic 3-part documentary for BBC Radio, which was, I think, called In Wordsworth's Footsteps, which had me in tears at some point. And it showed you to be the man that I know, a very humane man, a man very much in touch with the emotions of fine quality, of good writing, of great writing, in fact. And it's just so many goosebump moments, and I hope it's archived, and I would commend people to find it. In Wordsworth's Footsteps.
Yeah, we recorded that toward last summer, and it was broadcast beginning of this year, 2020, January and February, the year of Wordsworth's 250th anniversary. And it's on the BBC Sounds. I think should be there for a year. But the lovely thing about that is that although you think that radio is a medium that it doesn't make any difference where you are, but it does. That actually going to the Lake District, going to the West Country, going to Paris, there's something about the textures, the sounds of the places that really brought the poetry alive. And we were very fortunate as well that we had another great Simon actor, Sir Simon Russell Beale, reading the poems for us in that radio series.
The question I wanted to ask you was, not only what did it feel like to actually walk the ground that was trodden by Wordsworth, but I assume in your research, your hand gets to pass across the manuscripts across which the hand of Wordsworth passed. And how, I mean, I'm a terrible sentimentalist. I make I make no apology for it. But can you explain how that feels and what it gives to you as a writer when you're working on the biography of somebody like Wordsworth?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it does give me so much. In sharp contrast to Shakespeare, where you're working from printed sources and records, we only have one scene in Shakespeare's own hand. I mean, it's an amazing scene, and it's extraordinary to have handled that. But my three other biographies of John Clare, the peasant poet from Northamptonshire, another of the great Romantics, of the more recent poet, another poet of nature, Ted Hughes, and of Wordsworth. In each case, there's a huge body of the original manuscripts. John Clare's very movingly just kept in a little provincial museum in Peterborough, near where he lived. William Wordsworth's kept in the museum at Dove Cottage, where he lived. Ted Hughes's in two big archives, one in America, one in the British Library. But in each case, to read the manuscripts, to handle the poems, to see them evolving, being revised, second thoughts coming in, to have rough drafts and notes and scribblings. It's an extraordinary sensation. I think probably in each of those books there was one particular sort of spine-shivering moment. In the case of John Clare, when I handled the tiny pocket notebook that he kept with him when he escaped from the lunatic asylum and walked the 90 miles back in search of his childhood love, who was dead. Just holding that little notebook, I felt really in touch with Clare's spirit. Then in the Ted Hughes archive, finding, which no one had seen before, the diary entries that he wrote for the week of his wife Sylvia Plath's death. And then with Wordsworth, I think this wonderful moment, and we captured this in the radio programme, in the library at Dove Cottage. It's a little notebook that he had when he spent a winter in Germany with his sister Dorothy and with Coleridge. And he starts drafting these autobiographical poems, the first seeds of his great autobiographical epic, The Prelude. But then in that same notebook, you turn it upside down and turn to the back of it, and his sister Dorothy is writing her wonderful Grasmere journals, observing the life of nature. So just to hold that little notebook where there's the beautiful poetry of Wordsworth and the beautiful prose of Dorothy, amazing experience.
I can hear the emotion crackling in your voice. It makes me very jealous. Can we come to your latest book, which is entitled Radicaled Wordsworth, and it has a fantastic subtitle, which is The Poet Who Changed the World. Auden, of course, I'd be interested to know what you think of Auden, but famously wrote, "Poetry makes nothing happen." You seem to be setting your stall against Auden's truism, or not truism.
Exactly. But as I say towards the end of the book, later in that very interesting poem, Elegy on the Death of his fellow poet W.B. Yeats, he actually changes his mind. Yeah. He says poetry is a way of happening, a mouth. And he also says of the dead poet, he became his admirers. The idea that once the poet is dead, his work lives on in the bodies, the minds, the life, the work of his admirers. And the argument of my book is that that's what happened with Wordsworth. Wordsworth changed the way we see the world. If you think the mountains and lakes of the Lake District are beautiful, if you think a mountain is beautiful, you owe that to Wordsworth. Yeah. If you go to a property of the National Trust, or if you walk in one of the national parks, either in the UK or indeed here where I'm living in America, you owe that to Wordsworth. Wordsworth was the person who came up with the idea of a national park. If you believe that a formative aspect of who you are is key memories of childhood, little fragments of memory, you owe that to Wordsworth. He was the first person really to understand key childhood as key to formation of the self. So in all sorts of ways, Wordsworth did change the world. So what I do in the biography is I focus the life of Wordsworth on those radical years, the early time when he's influenced by the political radicalism of the French Revolution, then the radical poetic experimentation of the decade when he's working with Coleridge. But then as he becomes older, his poetry becomes more dull, I kind of execute a twist and focus more on Wordsworth's influence, the way that he inspired younger poets such as John Keats, and then the way he inspired a whole slew of great Victorian thinkers. So, for example, John Stuart Mill, the founder of the philosophy of liberalism, said that it was reading Wordsworth's poetry that saved him from a nervous breakdown, and he dealt with his depression. He cured himself of depression by means of Wordsworth's poetry. Wordsworth, throughout the Victorian period, was a huge psychological force.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. You put me in mind of a conversation I had recently here on Lockdown Litfest with Tom Holland, whose latest book, Dominion, argues that whether we choose to admit it or not, the seeds of Christianity have informed so much of societal structure for the last 2,000 years. And I like this idea that you're saying that Wordsworth, whether we choose to admit it or whether we recognize it or not, has informed so much of philosophy and thought, you know, for, as you say, from the rise of national parks to all sorts of things. Do you think he's been under-recognized? You're saying that he's been under-recognized for that influence?
I think that dimension of him has been under-recognized, and I think part of the problem there is that, you know, he didn't make the great romantic career move of dying young or going mad. The great thing about, I'm currently writing a biography of Keats, but it's partly Keats, it's someone else as well. But the great thing about Keats, Shelley, Byron, they died young, and there is just this body of blazingly brilliant work. John Clare went mad, as did several of the German romantic poets and composers. Poor old Wordsworth just became more and more sane, more and more boring, more and more conservative. Eventually became poet laureate and never wrote a word.
Yeah.
And you know, started writing sort of poems in defense of the death penalty and against the Great Reform Act. And you just think, oh my God, Wordsworth, why didn't you just die? Because then you would be a great romantic.
It's a bit of forgive me for this. I feel embarrassed to ask you, but I'm going to ask you anyway. It's a bit of a cheesy after dinner sort of question. It's impossible to research someone, and there's got to be questions that remain unanswered for future researchers, future biographers to try and ponder over. If you could get the famous sort of 5 minutes with Wordsworth, is there a burning question you think, I really want to know what he thought about this?
What I'd really want to know, I'm not sure I'd be able to ask him this directly because he wouldn't answer directly, but I'd be able to sort of see it. And that is, what exactly was his relationship with his sister? And I'd want to ask them both equally. There have been people who think there's something a little bit weirdly over-intimate about the fact that on the night before he got married, his sister lay all night wearing a wedding ring that he was then going to put on another woman, and that when he came back from the church, the person with whom he walked over the threshold was not his wife, but his sister. I don't actually think they slept together, but it was an incredibly intimate relationship. And I would just love to have witnessed William and Dorothy together in their prime, just to get a sense of what that relationship was like, because it was so creative for them both.
Do you think Dorothy had a role? I mean, it's sometimes argued, and forgive me, I'm not a scholar, but that she had a role in one of his more famous poems.
She had a role in many of his famous poems. I mean, his most famous poem, the Daffodils, Wandering Lonely as a Cloud. He wasn't actually wandering lonely as a cloud. He was wandering with Dorothy beside Lady Olswater. She carefully recorded the movement of the daffodils, and 2 years later, perhaps going to her journal, he came up with the idea of turning it into a poem. And what's more, although I'm furious with myself for leaving this in my notes and not putting it in my book, not only Dorothy, his sister, but also his wife Mary had a role in that poem, because what Wordsworth said later in life is the two best lines in the poem, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude, actually were made up by his wife Mary, not by him.
Ah, Well, there's a second edition of
Yeah, I know, I've got to add that in the second edition. I don't know why I left it in the notes. That's the infuriating thing about researching and writing a big book. You have so many notebooks, and then you get your publisher's deadline, and they're cracking the whip and saying, we must have it, we get this book out for its anniversary, and you just forget to go back and do one last check. Did I really include all those details?
It's called the publishing industry for a reason, Jonathan, and we are mere sausages in the machine. Let's wrap up with, would you do us the honour, do you have a favourite stanza of Wordsworth that you would like to perhaps deliver for our audience?
Yeah, I would, and that would be his extraordinary little poem that he wrote that cold winter in Germany. A slumber did my spirit seal. I had no human fears. She seemed a thing that could not feel the touch of earthly years. No motion has she now, no force. And then he describes how I think he's perhaps imagining Dorothy dying. And she neither hears nor sees, rolled round in earth's diurnal course with rocks and stones and trees.
Wow. Thank you, Jonathan, so much. Thank you so much for joining us here. What are you working on now? What can we expect from you in the future? You said you're writing about Keats and some...
About Keats, yes. So having done Wordsworth, the 250th anniversary of Wordsworth's birth last year, next year is the 200th anniversary of John Keats's death. I've always wanted to write about Keats. But there are many good biographies of Keats that go through his life from cradle to grave. Keats's life was very short, and many of those biographies are very long. So I wanted to approach Keats in a new way. And perhaps going back to my classical influences, I'm intrigued that the origin of biography was an ancient Greek writer called Plutarch, who wrote biographies called parallel lives, where he would take sort of a figure from ancient Greece and a figure from ancient Rome, write their lives and then compare them. And I thought, that's an interesting device. So I'm going to write a parallel life of John Keats. It'll be a short life of John Keats, and a later writer who was obsessed with John Keats and who I think was like John Keats, who was to the novel what John Keats was to poetry. The book is called Bright Star, Green Light. Bright Star is Keats. Do you know what the green light is?
I'm desperately trying to think.
It's the green light on the end of Daisy Faye's dock in The Great Gatsby. F. Scott Fitzgerald. Was obsessed with John Keats. So it's a book about Keats and Scott Fitzgerald.
That sounds magnificent. Good luck with that. Good heavens.
Well, thank you. Well, let us hope sincerely that we are not still locked down by then. But if there is the dreaded second wave, let's talk about Keats and Fitzgerald next year. Let's hope not.
Would you please? Jonathan, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. You've been listening to Jonathan Bate and I talking about his latest book, amongst other things. The book's entitled Radical Wordsworth, the Poet Who Changed the World. And keep a lookout on our website, www.lockdownlitfest.com, for a buy the book button. And I can commend it to you. It's fantastic. I can't wait to see the Keats and John and F. Scott Fitzgerald. I'm desperately thinking about that. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Do feel free to tell your friends. We're in our early days. We are trying to build our audience and build our content. Everything is archived, so you never need miss out on anything. Do sign up for the newsletter. It's the best way that we can tell you about what we're planning for the weeks ahead. And boy, do we have some plans, as ever. We hope you're safe. We hope you're keeping well. And we hope you're being careful. Thank you for joining us. Cheerio.